Megérné kilépni az EU-ból?
Soros birodalom által megtestesített liberális élet és világszemlélet és hatalmas hálózat és világerő, ez most kiszorul Amerikából, és már csak Brüsszel van a kezében, de Brüsszel a kezében van. Tehát nekünk patriótáknak azzal kell szembenéznünk, hogy Soros elvesztette Washingtont, de Brüsszelt még a kezében tartja. Ide vonul vissza.
Az Orbán-kormány egyre közelebb lavírozza az országot ahhoz, hogy kizárjanak minket az Európai Unióból. Kötelezettségszegések egész sora és súlyos jogsértések mellett az is kockáztatja a helyzetünket, hogy az EU és NATO tagsággal járó vétójogokkal rendre visszaél a magyar hatalom. A putyini úton fontos mérföldkő volt, amikor a NER első számú ellenségé nevezte ki Brüsszelt, de ez sem egyik napról a másikra ment végbe. Az elmúlt 10 év alatt lépésről lépésre vált egyre radikálisabbá a magyar kormány ellenségeskedése az Európai Unió központi intézményeivel, bár már a 2010-es első kétharmad idején kapott kritikákat és a médiatörvény első változatát még megnyírbálni kényszerült a Fidesz-KDNP, a középkonzervatív Európai Néppárt akarásában elég sokáig ellavírozott a Fidesz. A magyarországi gazdasági és munkapolitika készségesen kiszolgálta a nyugat-európai, elsősorban a német gazdasági érdekeket, és a túlkapásokért cserébe inkább csak ennyi-bennyék jártak, mint komolyan vehető következmények. De lassanként azért szorult a hurok, részben közpénzekkel, így például az EU-s pénzekkel való orbitális visszaélések hírére, részben pedig a független sajtóval és civilekkel szembeni egyre durvább elnyomásra és a végrehajtó hatalom koncentrálására, így például a bíróságok autonómiájának csorbítására. Idővel azért a konzervatívok is kénytelenek voltak érdemben reagálni. Orbán hosszú ideig az EU-s konzervatívok hasznos hülyéje volt, különösen a bevándorlás kérdésében. Nagy szolgálatot tett ugyanis azoknak, akik szerették volna a civilizált politikus látszatát megőrizni, de boldogan profitáltak abból, hogy az elvetemült működésével Orbán egyre inkább jobb oldalra srófolja a politikai középmértéket. Az sem elhanyagolható persze, hogy az Orbán-féle túlkapások kritikájával olcsón megúszza, hogy demokratának mutassa magát bármely európai politikus. Már akkor lehetett tudni, hogy nagy a baj, amikor Magyarország 2019-ben kilépett az Eurovíziós Dalfesztiválból, de csak ezután jött a java. Ekkora felhalmozódott egy sor vitás kérdés, amiket az Európai Bizottság és az Európai Parlament is egyre komolyabban vett. A rugalmas póráz azonban végleg elszakadt, amikor 2021-ben az Európai Néppárt hosszú időhúzást követően nagy nehezen fogcsigorgatva kizárta a soraiból a Fideszt, majd a súlyos szabálysértéseket büntetésül többpárti összefogással bizonyos Magyarországnak szánt forrásokat is befagyasztottak. Ezeket a forrásokat nem vonták meg, hanem minimum feltételekhez kötötték, de a magyar kormány nem volt hajlandó ezeket sem teljesíteni, illetve csak kozmetikai intézkedéseket tett, viszont cserébe közellenségé kiáltottak ki, és azóta is nyíltan gyűlölködik az EU-ra és uniós kritikusaira a NER, így például minden magyar politikusra, aki szóvá meri tenni, hogy a pénzmegvonás oka nem valami sátáni marxista olvasókör, hanem maga a magyar kormány. Mostanra már bevett szóhasználata hadat üzenni Brüsszelnek. Orbán március 15-én azt ígérte, hogy elfoglalja Brüsszelt, de ő is, a hozzá közel álló kormányelemek is pedzegetik, hogy alkalmasint Magyarország ki is léphetne az EU-ból.
Ha meg akarjuk őrizni Magyarország szabadságát és szuverenitását, nincs más választásunk, el kell foglalnunk Brüsszelt.
Nem Orbán az első, aki ilyesmivel kampányol, de akinek ez összejött, az nem tette zsebre. Éppen ezért ma a Brexit tanulságairól beszélgetünk, mindenki eldöntheti magának, mennyire vonzó számára ez a modell.
None of the Brexiteers knew what Brexit was actually going to look like.
The political steps undertaken do not resonate with this.
It's always going to make more sense for the UK when it comes to making a choice between Europe and the United States to go with Europe.
Hypothetically, of course, the UK could rejoin the EU.
All in all, we can say that Brexit, as far as the Britons are concerned, has not been a success.
A Brexit nem egy egyenes analógia az esetleges magyar exodushoz, mivel Nagy-Britannia sokkal kedvezőbb gazdasági helyzetben volt, amikor kilépett, mint a mostanra folyamatos összeomlásokat produkáló Magyarország. Vannak azonban megdöbbentő hasonlóságok. A Brexit egy kommunikációs stratégia volt, nem közpolitikai felvetés. A saját alkalmatlanságába egyre inkább belecsavarodó brit konzervatív párt, a Torik, kétségbeesésükben ezzel próbálták a politikai pozícióikat bebiztosítani, aminek jelentős gazdasági veszteségek, politikai feszültség és kudarcok sorozata lett az eredménye, Többek között például a koronavírus járvány kezelésében is. 2016 nyarán hajszányi többséggel a szavazók mindössze 51,89%-a választotta az Unióból való kilépést, és a döntés megalapozottságát jellemzi, hogy másnap felhasználók tömegei kerestek rá kétségbeesetten, hogy mit jelent elhagyni az EU-t, meg mi az EU, és ehhez hasonló alapvető kérdésekre. Azóta 5 miniszterelnök bukott bele ebbe, és még a legfelkészültebbeknek is belevásott a foga a kérdésbe. A balul elsült népszavazás után rövid úton lemondott David Cameron, komolyan vette a feladatot, de látványosan beletört a Brexitbe a bicskája Theresa Maynek, tőle a politikai álmokfutó Boris Johnson vette át a stafétát, aki nem csak az Unióból való kiválással, de a járványkezeléssel is csúnyán beleállt a földbe. 47 évnyi tagság után 2020. január 31-én az Egyesült Királyság végül is hivatalosan is kilépett az Európai Unióból, és heteken belül beköszöntött a Covid-járvány, aminek a kezelése káoszt hozott a hirtelen nagyon szuverén Nagy-Britanniában. Apropó szuverén, a skót függetlenségi mozgolódást is felélénkítette a Brexit, és a végeláthatatlan politikai-gazdasági szerencsétlenkedés megsokszorozta a közvetlen szomszédok, így például Írország és Hollandia EU iránti elköteleződését. Boris Johnson aztán botrányok közepette mondott le, amikor kiderült, hogy a saját járvány szabályai dacára piás kabinetbuligon dinomdánomozott a kollégáival, miközben a lakosság számára a kijárást is korlátozták. És ha azt hittük, hogy ennél nincs lejjebb, hát tévedtünk. Történelmi léptékű kormányzást produkált Liz Truss, aki egyetlen bejelentéssel beszakította a padlót a brit gazdaság alatt, és 45 nap alatt bele is bukott a dologba olyan sebességgel, hogy még egy hírhedt fejes saláta is tovább bírta, mint ő a hivatalban. A lejtmenetet pedig Rishi Sunak fejezte be, aki emberemlékezet óta példátlan választási vereséget szenvedett el. Most másfél évtized után először baloldali kormány van, ami kétségbeesetten próbálja azokat a megállapodásokat megkötni, amiben annak idején Theresa May belebukott, hát meglátjuk, mi lesz a vége. Talán az is megütheti a magyar néző inger küszöbét, hogy úgy tűnik, gyanús forrásból jelentős pénzeket öltek a kilépés melletti kampányba. Az adakozó kedvű Aaron Banks a maga 8 millió angol fontos hozzájárulásával minden idők legbőkezűbb politikai donorának számít az Egyesült Királyságban, de az Open Democracy és a Guardian nyomozásai alapján vizsgálatok indultak, mert úgy tűnik, csak nem saját zsebből állta a több mint 3,5 milliárd forintnyi adományát? Politikai kudarcok egész sora után a konzervatívok tavaly példátlan politikai vereséget szenvedtek, de nem áll valami szépen a most kormányzó baloldal sem, részben azért, mert kénytelenek folyamatosan tüzet oltani, részben pedig azért, mert próbálnak folyamatosan sikerkommunikációt folytatni, ami ebben a helyzetben teljesen lehetetlen. A legutóbbi önkormányzati választásokon például tarolt a Brexit kampány legnagyobb nyertese, Nigel Farage pártja, azért a Nigel Farage, aki nyilvánvaló hazugságokkal és alig burkolt rasszista úszítással kampányolt az EU-ból való kilépés mellett 2016-ban, többek között például a mi honfitársaink az Egyesült Királyságba kivándorolt kelet-európaiak ellen hergelve. A torik nyilvánvalóan hazárdjátékot játszottak, amikor a Nigel Farage-féle EU ellenességgel próbálták a hatalmukat megszilárdítani. Ez a szélsőjobbra előzés végül maga alá temette őket, most pedig, hogy Trump elnöksége felrúgja a nemzetközi együttműködések teljes rendszerét, már nem csak gazdasági, de biztonsági okokból is bőven van miért izzadnia a briteknek. De nem kell nekem elhiggyétek, a mai adásban 2 brit és egy holland hozzáértővel beszélgetek arról, hogyan sikerült a Brexit, és miért nem sikerült ennél jobban. A vendégeink Misha Glenny, aki évtizedekig volt a BBC közép-európai tudósítója, a rendszerváltás idején Magyarországról is riportozott, és a délszláv háborúkat is végig tudósította. Ma a Bécsi Humántudományi Kutatóintézet az IVM rektora, és kutatási területei közé tartozik a nemzetközi szervezetbűnözés és a kiberbiztonság. Roos Fransen holland kutatójogász, európai és nemzetközi jogot tanít a Bécsi Egyetemen, jogharmonizációval, uniós joggal is foglalkozik. Luke Cooper, a londoni School of Economics munkatársa, a Bécsi Humántudományi Kutatóintézet korábbi vendégkutatója, a Másik Európa Podcast műsorvezetője. Legfrissebb könyve az autoritár fertőzés, Trump és a Brexit párhuzamos történeteit vizsgálja a szélső jobboldal előretörésében. A mai beszélgetés házigazdája a Bécsi Szépművészeti Egyetem könyvtára, köszönjük nekik a vendéglátást! Hello, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me about Brexit. I want to start with you, Misha, if you don't mind. Already 5-6 years ago, you have been speculating, forecasting, analyzing what Brexit would mean for the entire Union, or the rest of the Union, as you phrased then. Now EU skepticism seems to be rising. there's a strong polarization between a push for a stronger, more concentrated union or a looser union or even departure from the EU?
Well, I don't think that latter point that you're making is directly related to Brexit, and let me explain why. One of the first impacts of Brexit was actually to reduce the desire amongst populations in the rest of the Union to leave the European Union, because they saw what the dismantling of 40 years of regulatory alignment between the United Kingdom and Brussels actually meant. It brought few, if any, advantages and a whole range of disadvantages. Some of them are to do with that dismantling of the regulatory alignment. Some are to do with the specific nature of constitutional arrangements in the United Kingdom, particularly as regards Northern Ireland. But we now know, looking back, that we have lost at least 4% of our economy. It's actually increased the red tape that Britons have to deal with, in particular when they're trading with the European Union, and given that the European Union is by far our largest trading partner. And so what you've seen in opinion polls since then is that the number of people who want to return to the European Union has actually crossed over the 60% mark to about 66% now. So all in all, we can say that Brexit, as far as the Britons are concerned, has not been a success. I think that it's also dampened the desire for a Frexit or an Exit or a whatever it is, Xit. That issue you said at the end, though, about rising skepticism, a polarization, that's got less to do with the European Union per se, and more to do with or at least it's influenced by a whole range of other issues, above all else migration, but also the impact of social media. We are also quite sensitive towards what's happened in the United States. There's the issue of Ukraine, which has polarized electorates in various countries. And after Trump's election in the United States, I think that sentiment is strengthening all the time.
You mentioned the desire of, or even the thinking of rejoining the Union. Roos, you're a person for rules and regulations and how things actually get done. Mm-hmm. Is there even a possibility and a pathway for that?
This comes with a couple of conditions. The main one that the Union promotes is that member states must uphold the values of the Union, which is why, for example, a lot of Southern Eastern European states have not been able to join, as one of the primary conditions is democracy and have the highest standards of anti-corruption. So in general, when it comes to international organizations, there's always a withdrawal clause, which is Article 50 that was used and was, highly publicized during the Brexit negotiations. And there's also an entry clause, which is Article 49. Furthermore, there has to be an agreement made between the acceding state and the member states, which has to be agreed upon unanimously by all member states. Hypothetically, of course, the UK could rejoin the EU if you just are looking at black letter law. If you're looking at everything else in the European Union, as it's very difficult to look at international and European law as just that, you have to consider the political and diplomatic factors. Whilst the consensus in the UK may be that they want to rejoin, the political steps undertaken do not resonate with this. For example, the UK has not rejoined EFTA, which is what, for example, Norway and Iceland are part of the Free Trading Association, which they very much were allowed to do. There have been no moves towards that. And
I guess also because EFTA also comes with financial obligations.
Yes, it comes with obligations, which was one of the main selling points as to why the UK wanted to leave, being we do not want the obligations that come with any European association. The biggest crisis in UK perspective is at Calais, at the English Channel. This would have to be addressed, and from my knowledge of UK politics, which is relatively okay but not vast, this is something that we would all like to shove under the table a little bit more, or at least use as a political tool to gain voters.
Yeah, although, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my impression back in 2016 during the vote was that the main concern was with our compatriots, mostly Eastern Europeans like myself and my Slav cousins. The idea of maybe take these backseas, maybe walking this back, came up the day after the Brexit vote. Why did very few people campaign for Remain? For instance, the major opposition party, Labour, zero campaigning on Remain. How is that possible?
Well, I wouldn't say there was zero campaigning on for Remain. I mean, I'm probably likely to be a bit defensive here as both a Labour Party member in my spare time and a one-time Remain campaigner in that very referendum. Well, I think that it was certainly the case that the Labour leader at the time was not an organic enthusiast for the European Union. So he wasn't the most passionate advocate. I would say I don't think that was the reason that the Remain campaign went down in quite the way that it did. I think there you'd have to blame the government of the day, David Cameron, but also the broader political context at the time. So what the Remain campaign had as its main idea is that more or less things were fine. Britain was fine. Maybe it's been through a tough few years for austerity, but it was on the right track and everything was okay. And the basic structural problem that the campaign encountered is that a lot of Britons at the time and since, didn't think things were going fine at all, like many places in Europe. I think the other problem was the coincidence of timing of the referendum with the real peak of the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis. I think it was really quite different because up until that point of the Eurozone crisis that of course dragged on for all of those years, the really big argument for the European Union in Britain was that this was an economically competent outfit. And even though we don't particularly like giving up our sovereignty to anyone, because there's a kind of incipient xenophobia and nationalism that's very strong here. Nonetheless, we're happy to make that concession for a bloc that works.
Misha, you also wrote about how Brexit is a great opportunity for organized crime.
Whenever you put borders up, you are creating opportunities for organized crime. Having said that, the UK was outside of the Schengen zone, so it had quite a few borders, but it also had a very good integration in policing the European Union. Outside the European Union, that doesn't work anymore. And so it gives criminals and ne'er-do-wells real opportunities, particularly when you don't have, as in the United Kingdom, enough investment in the border infrastructure that you're putting up. Some of those regions which voted for Brexit most heavily were actually recipients, considerable recipients of EU structural funding. So if you take somewhere like Cornwall, which is the poorest county in England, Cornwall has been devastated by Brexit because on its own, London doesn't have the financial firepower to compensate for the money that was being fed into Cornwall by Brussels. And one thing which, if you tell Britons, they still to this day don't understand, that the percentage of our budget that went to Brussels was 0.7% of the budget, just 0.7%. And the value we got out of that 0.7%, well, we know now it's 4% of the economy that we get back. So you have to look elsewhere. You have to look, I think, in terms of emotions when it comes to why Brexit was so powerful. Along with the one thing which Luke and I, I'm sure, really agree on is that the austerity policies which George Osborne introduced after 2010 as Chancellor of the Exchequer were an absolute disaster
The EU is often cited as an economic project, but quite as much it's a legalistic project, and a gigantic one at that. How do you see this harmonization process, which is often very fraught?
It is very important to separate the EU from more traditional international organizations like the UN, where the UN is an intergovernmental organization, which means that it is very much a separate entity from a state, whereas the European Union is more often described as a supranational organization, meaning it has actual legal influence. And harmonization, whilst heavily published, funnily enough, is a major topic discussed in your law school early days because no one understands what it actually means. Harmonization essentially is the idea that if we look purely from an economic standpoint first, we want to make sure that companies do not receive benefits from having economic activity in one country over another due to their regulations. In Austria, there has been a discussion regarding gold plating, which is essentially countries going above and beyond and implementing the minimum measures, but then also trying to make them as perfect as possible. That's actually not what the EU wants. The EU wants you to implement the legislation they produce as carbon copy as possible, which is actually what the UK was doing for a very long time, is taking the directive that the Commission may produce and just saying, okay, this applies now. I believe you guys joined in '74?
That's right. We had the referendum and we joined the EEC, as it was, the European Economic Community. So we were latecomers, and for a long time the French were determined to keep Britain out of the EEC. So no, we were not one of the founders, one of the instigators of this, but we became very enthusiastic members very quickly. Yeah.
I come from the Netherlands, which does the same as the UK in that we quite literally take the legislation that is given and implement it as is. And for us, that has worked out quite well.
This current huge upheaval, which many have termed the collapse of the pre-existing world order, as it is now with the war in Ukraine, exacerbated, or I would say further unstabilized by the Trump administration. This seems to give a huge opportunity for Britain to reposition itself. What do you think, Luke?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I think that the crisis and the UK's role in European security does present a kind of geopolitical opportunity, you could say, for the UK, given that we spend a reasonable amount of money on defence compared to some other Western European nations, and that we're considered important. I mean, there's kind of two positions, I'd say, among European states at the moment with regard to this American administration. One you could refer to as the Starmer position or the British position, which is broadly, we think it's possible to keep the United States on side and to secure the 80-year relationship between the United States and Europe. And then the second position after Starmer, I think, is encapsulated by the incoming Chancellor of Germany, Merz, who's dared in a way to call for independence from the United States. I think a pretty striking thing for an ardent transatlanticist to do, and a real sign of the historicity of this moment. Europe is the UK's largest trading partner, so it's always going to make more sense for the UK when it comes to making a choice between Europe and the United States to go with Europe. To my pleasant surprise, and perhaps to the pleasant surprise of your watchers and viewers and listeners, the UK is actually the most anti-Trump country in Europe. For the UK government, in the end, I think it's really the clock is ticking for how long this position can last, because it seems pretty untenable to me.
Nyilván hallottátok, hogy a független sajtó elleni támadás újabb fázisába lépett, népellenségének bélyegzés belengetett visszamenőleges forráselvonás, jogrenden kívüli eszközök, ezek az átlátszót is sújtják, sőt, az átlátszó az elsők között van a szuverenitás védelmének csúfolt hivatal kilövési listáján. Éppen emiatt még nagyobb jelentősége van mindannak a támogatásnak, amit az átlátszó belföldről kap. Ha tudjátok, támogassátok az átlátszót belföldi adományokkal, vagy ha nem éltek Magyarországon, esetleg kettős állampolgárok vagytok, támogathatjátok a testvérlapot, az Átlátszó Erdélyt. Link a leírásban. Most pedig térjünk vissza a beszélgetéshez.
When Brexit was decided upon and implemented, we weren't yet in a world, although I think we were heading there, of large trading blocks. So the UK comes out just at the wrong time, just as these large trading blocks start to consolidate, and that isn't just Trump. It was when Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and so on, massive state subsidies, giving unfair competition or subsidizing big US companies. Chinese were doing the same. The European Union responded, and there's the United Kingdom outside of the European Union. It doesn't have the financial firepower to compete with either the US or the EU. So Britain, just at the time when you need to be part of a strong union of some form or another, is out on its own and extremely vulnerable.
I totally agree, as you know, Misha. But I just wanted to add, I think the earlier you opened with some maybe slightly optimistic description of the opinion polling in the UK vis-a-vis the European Union. Let's say, I think what has changed now isn't really about opinion polling. That since 2022 and the disaster of British politics in that year, fall of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, it's been pretty consistent that Rejoin would win. What I think has changed right now is that Rejoin have a winning message, which is the security and defence of Britain means the security and defence of Europe.
It is also quite odd in the current geopolitical and international legal climate to have a country so out of any regional international organization. I mean, every country on this earth is, well, maybe except for North Korea as a shining example, is in some form or another associated with a regional organization, whether it be a purely economic union as we see them in Africa, or a more security-based union like the OSCE, but also, the successor of the Warsaw Pact in Asia and in the former USSR countries. It's such an oddity to have a country like the UK, which is traditionally seen as an absolute powerhouse, be so on its own, which is in academic terms very interesting to observe.
None of the Brexiteers knew what Brexit was actually going to look like. It was all on a wing and a prayer, and you had lots of different groups thinking that they would see it as an anti-immigration thing. Well, that turned out to be wrong. Others who saw it as a way of getting closer to America, well, that was very risky. And others saw in sovereignty somehow a way of inspiring the nation. And again, that's a failure. Others said that potential problems like the constitutional relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or Scotland and England and Wales and England, they said, oh, well, these are not going to be serious problems. They're actually deeply serious problems. So it was, it was a fantasy project that sadly became reality because of a peculiar constellation of political, economic and social circumstances.
And many investigative journalists argue an infusion of a lot of dark money into the campaign that, due to the nature of promotion and social media, like fragmented communications, wasn't very obviously visible at the time. And
also we had, the main media outlets, private media outlets above all, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper stable, Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail, and the Barclay Brothers Daily Telegraph. 85% of the print media in the UK, of the major print media, run by, octogenarians who didn't live in the United Kingdom and in some cases were not British citizens.
I agree with you that the responsibility of journalists and media conglomerates cannot really be overstated in these cases and generally in the level of public discourse that we live with. Is it possible to use this opportunity for the UK to step up in support of Ukraine against Russian aggression and thus gradually get closer to the Union? Because as haphazardly as Brexit was done, I assume that a very haphazard attempt to rejoin may also generate a couple of huge mistakes.
I think you're right in your question that it will be done in a series of stages, and they probably won't be very dramatic. They will probably be quite dull. But I mean, I think British participation in some kind of European force on the ground in Ukraine, if it happens, and I mean, it's a very big if at the moment. I mean, it really will depend, I think, on whether those 15 nations have confidence in the agreement that has been struck and have confidence in it lasting. What I would say is that I think, something that your IWM colleague Tim Snyder says, Misha Glenny, he likes to say that there's the myth of the European peace project. And really Europe is better seen as a kind of post-colonial project. Empires collapsed and European states saw a necessity, not just an opportunity, to do something else. And that something else was the European Union. And I think Ukraine's membership of the European Union will really, I think, pose that quite strongly, or pose the need to be clear about that decision that this is a security project as much as it is a peace project. Especially
now with NATO very rapidly, changing in significance, to put it very mildly, because as much as I understand, the concept was that NATO is the security union and the EU is the legal and economic union that complement each other. And now with the US being so volatile, that doesn't seem to work the way it had been intended, especially in terms of extreme military dependence on the US in every regard.
The project of how do you adjust European security if NATO is significantly weakened or collapses. In the past 10 to 12 years, we've seen the process called digital transformation, which means shifting everything from hardware into the cloud. And have a look at who controls the cloud, whether you're a police force, whether you're military, whether you're in a corporation, or whether you're in a home user. It's Amazon Web Services, it's Google, and then for the security issues, you have Cloudflare, you have CrowdStrike. Where are all these companies based? They're based in the United States. So we are completely and utterly dependent on American-owned cyber infrastructure, weapons infrastructure, and robotics. If we want to create a European security network, we also have to face the challenge of coming up with an alternative to GPS, Galileo, whatever it's going to be. And at the moment, there might be a sort of theoretical appetite for it, but there's certainly no capacity and capability to do that sort of thing. And either Europe gets its act together, or it's going to have to accept a semi-colonialist relationship with the United States, or pick China. Who knows?
The EU has pretty much led the way, at least at its own scale, in regulating the digital space, especially which the US has been extremely reluctant to touch.
I mean, the Trump 2.0 is Silicon Valley in a fundamental respect. They're all lined up. Have a look at who was there in the first line at the inauguration. It was Musk, it was Thiel, it was Zuckerberg, it was Bezos. They were all there. And you're seeing what Elon Musk is doing, gutting the American states, tossing it all out like yesterday's offal. These people have immense power. They do not want regulatory systems like the EU has in place.
The EU prides itself so much on the regulations done in the digital space. I mean, it started with the privacy legislation in the GDPR, but it goes much further. And I do not think it would be an option to fully abandon that. I think one could speak about maybe loosening a little. And I think there will be a certain sense of paranoia for these companies who are all of a sudden back invited in with looser legislation. So I do not think it's a possibility that's going to happen.
Is there a component of pride, somehow like an extension of national pride that we can expect to develop around the EU over time? Because it's right now, it's very much not just a supranational, but also kind of a post-national project that didn't demand to be your identity. There have been attempts, but let's be honest, not very successful.
Speaking out of personal views, especially as I was the demographic that was definitely targeted with these marketing attempts of making it a one Europe, I do not think so, because we are in that way very different from the United States, which is a federal state. However, they may claim that they have more different ethnicities and cultures than we do. There's such rich history in the individual nation states of the European Union that it will be practically impossible to have one common identity that just, you cannot expect someone from Germany to have the complete same values as someone from Croatia. There's such cultural significant differences that it's going to be very difficult to have a proud European identity.
I mean, it's survival, not sentimentality. I mean, look at what's happening the other side of the Atlantic. You would much rather be in Europe than you would be Canada right now, I think, given what's happening next door. So I think the message really that Europe has, which is a strong one, is about security and survival in this period of crisis. I mostly agree with you, Misha, in your outline, but I think a semi-colony of the United States is maybe too strong. But Europe does have cards that it can play in this game. I think they're pretty big ones. You know, it's an enormous consumer market. It's a regulatory superpower, as you guys have been emphasizing. But I think most of all, this question of uniting with the rest of the world is the critical one, and that does include China. And I think in the end, Trump has started a trade war that he can't win, and that's the opportunity for Europe, because Europe plus Canada plus Mexico plus China plus Brazil plus India plus South Africa, I mean that alliance economically would I think will defeat what Trump is trying to do to the global system.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the European Union doesn't have to be a centralized state, and it is culturally, of course, very diverse.
I strongly disagree. I think we need a united European identity, and for that, we need a sitcom based in the suburbs of Vienna. With all my Slav friends. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Te maradnál EU-tag, vagy inkább visszaadnád a bordó útleveledet? Írd meg nekünk kommentben, és ha már arra jársz, húzz egy lájkot és kövess be a csatornát. Küldd el a műsort a vonatbámuló kisöcsédnek, meg a tanyabájkos nagymamádnak, és ha módod van rá, támogasd az átlátszót. Ez a műsor az Eurozin és a Display Europe produkciója. Médiapartnerink a bécsi Októ TV és Magyarországon az Átlátszó. Ez a talkshow az Európai Unió és az Európai Kulturális Alapítvány társfinanszírozásával készül. Fontos, hogy az itt kifejtett nézetek és vélemények, a megszólalók és a szerzők sajátjai nem feltétlenül tükrözik az Európai Unió, vagy akár az Európai Oktatási és Kulturális Végrehajtó Ügynökség véleményét. Sem az EU, sem az EACEA nem tehető felelőssé értük. Köszönjük a Bécsi Szépművészeti Egyetem könyvtárának, hogy vendégül láttak.